Okay, so I'm Gail Slater. Thank you, everyone, for being here to kick off these listening sessions. It's one of three we're tasked with via executive order. I had a few thank yous. So Marcus Burzell, who is over there, the other Marcus, not to be confused with Marcus Meyer, formerly of the FTC, Meredith Andrews. Hi, Meredith. It's good to see you. Cara Monahan, to my right, and Jill McGuire to my left. Thanks to everyone. These were the principal organizers for this listening session and others going forward. I have a few prepared remarks. Thank you again, Marcus, for those, to kick off, just to frame the issue a bit and tee us off today. So welcome to the first of three listening sessions hosted jointly by the Department of Justice, Antitrust Division, and the Federal Trade Commission on drug pricing. We are here today because President Trump has given us a mandate under several executive orders now to investigate anti-competitive practices in the pharmaceutical industry and to take decisive action to combat those practices. As Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division, I hear constantly from Americans about the high cost of prescription drugs. These costs are particularly acute for patients who must take medications to treat lengthy or chronic conditions, and we have a few of those folks with us today, like cancer or autoimmune disorders. Working class Americans should not have to skimp on life's necessities to afford life-sustaining medicine for their families. And high drug costs impose a steep tax on businesses, both small and large, that offer health insurance to their employees. Competition can play an important role in lowering drug prices. Without doubt, it's important to incentivize innovation that brings new life-saving treatments to market. Many candidate drugs fail, and shepherding a drug through the new drug approval process often costs a great deal of money. But there's a crucial difference between supporting innovation and gamesmanship. We do not condone rent-seeking that blocks or raises the price of generic or biosimilar treatments, and we must be vigilant that regulatory barriers do not unnecessarily favor incumbents or make markets susceptible to this rent-seeking. Today, several scholars and advocates will speak about these issues, and we have received many questions from the public already. But I know that these topics touch many other people and businesses in America, and we want to hear from you because we work for you at the end of the day. If you have concerns about specific anti-competitive practices, please reach out to the DOJ and FTC directly or through the Healthy Competition Complaint Center. And the web address for that is healthycompetition.gov. The Trump-Vance administration is committed to putting Americans first by promoting more competitive drug prices. So let's get to work. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for that introduction. My name is Cara Monahan. I am the Deputy Assistant Director of the FTC's Healthcare Division, and I will be one of the moderators for today's session, along with Jill McGuire from the DOJ's Antitrust Division. Today's session considers anti-competitive conduct by pharmaceutical companies that delays or impedes generic or biosimilar competition. We will have two one-hour panel discussions. Upon the conclusion of the first panel, we will move into the second panel after a very short break. We invited members of the public to submit questions for our panelists, and we have incorporated some of those questions into today's program. We have a lot to cover in the next 2 hours, so I'm going to do my best to keep us on track, and I would ask that all panelists be mindful of time constraints when responding to questions. Our first panel today will focus on anti-competitive conduct by pharmaceutical manufacturers that delays competition from lower-priced generics or biosimilar alternatives. Among other things, this panel will touch on current trends related to pay-for-delay agreements, exclusive supply agreements, and the impacts of restricted distribution on competition.
Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. My name is Jill McGuire, and I'm the Acting Chief of the Healthcare and Consumer Products section at the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division. We're going to go ahead and introduce the members of our panel this afternoon. On our first panel to my right, we have Ms. Sneha Dave. She is the founder and executive director at Generation Patient, an organization representing over 25 million young adults with chronic conditions in the United States and abroad. Generation Patient leads research and policy reform in a number of key areas, including the patent system. Ms. Dave has testified on Capitol Hill, spoken at the World Economic Forum, and serves on editorial and advisory boards related to medical research.
Marcus Meyer was the Assistant Director of the Healthcare Division at the Federal Trade Commission until his retirement at the end of 2023. Mr. Meyer was responsible for investigating and litigating violations of antitrust law in the pharmaceutical and healthcare sectors. During his tenure, Mr. Meyer and his team had 2 cases that went to the U.S. Supreme Court and numerous other cases that collectively resulted in judgments or settlements of more than $1.8 billion for consumers.
Hans Zauer is Deputy General Counsel and Vice President for Intellectual Property at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, which is a major trade association representing biotechnology companies, industry leaders, and state biotech associations in the United States and abroad. At Bio, Mr. Zauer advises the organization's staff and members on patent and other intellectual property-related matters. Mr. Zauer also has significant in-house experience in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries, where he worked on, among other things, several drug development programs, patent prosecution, and patent portfolio oversight.
Stephen Schandelmeyer is a professor of pharmaceutical economics in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Minnesota, where he holds the Century Mortar Club Endowed Chair in Pharmaceutical Management and Economics. Dr. Schandelmeyer is the director of the Prime Institute, which focuses on pharmaceutical research related to management and economics. He has broad expertise in prescription drug reimbursement, drug benefit plan management, and pharmaceutical pricing patterns.
And lastly, Shashank Upadhyay is a partner at Upadhyay Tang LLP and is also a former chief in-house counsel at 3 leading pharmaceutical companies. He has focused his career on pharmaceutical law with an emphasis on IP and FDA issues, and he is a prolific speaker and writer on various topics such as drug development and approval, the Hatch-Waxman Act, and patent law. Mr. Upadhyay is the author of the leading treatise on FDA laws for drug development, generic pharmaceutical patent, and FDA law. All right. Panelists, we're so glad that you're here and we're ready to have a great discussion with you. So I'm going to kick us off with a question first to Mr. Upadhyay. Generic drugs and biosimilars play an important role in fostering price competition in pharmaceutical markets. As a result, they can be targets of anti-competitive conduct by brand drugs whose monopolies they threaten. The FTC and private plaintiffs have challenged various restrictions that brands use to delay generic competition, such as exclusive agreements or restricted distribution systems. Can you address these strategies and identify where you see the most risk to competition?
Great. Thank you very much. And I appreciate the FTC and the DOJ having us over to talk about these important issues. As a private law firm lawyer, I have to give a standard disclaimer that these represent my personal views and not any views of any client, past, present, or in the future. So with that in mind, my experience is both on the brand side and the generic side, and my goal in addressing these types of solutions is for fairness, predictability, and certainty, because that's exactly what our clients need. We can't be operating in the nebulous or the ambiguous zone. So with respect to the question that's been presented, there are several contracts that can be scrutinized or maybe warrant further scrutiny. The first one relates to contracts on exclusive supply of the key intermediates that then get formed into the API. There are sometimes very few companies that make these critical ingredients, and therefore getting exclusive contracts on the key intermediates means that ultimately bulk suppliers may not be able to produce the API at the end and then make it available. Another area is obviously in the contracts in which there's an exclusive supply for the approved DMF holders. A consequence of that is that it takes time for an unapproved DMF holder to go through the FDA regulatory approval process in order to get approval and then can become a supermarket of API to finished dosage form companies in the ANDA world. There's patent settlements, that are there between the first filer and the first ANDA applicant, in which the contract will protect the 180-day exclusivity, whether or not the 180-day exclusivity has been legally forfeited. So in other words, if there's a settlement by subsequent filers in the ANDA world, they are necessarily going to be day 181 launch as opposed to a day 1 launch, when they could normally be approved at day 1 from an FDA perspective, but by contract they cannot actually launch until day 181. But the area I'd really like to focus on in the last few minutes is the contracts on devices, when the device is part of the drug device combination. Because the FDA wants strict compliance between the physical characteristics between the RLD and the generic drug, more often than not, there are physical characteristics that are just only suited by the branded drug device. So what that means is that the generic company will either face the situation, a dilemma, that if they are going to be TE rated, they're going to have to basically have the same or similar characteristics or physical characteristics. And if they change the device in a way, it causes two problems. Number one, the FDA actually has to do the scientific work to evaluate those differences, which it doesn't want to do, and therefore is prone to actually just issue a rejection, or at least not permit you to go ahead with the different device. Or secondly, even if you're lucky enough to get this device through the FDA, then they are going to review these characteristics from a scientific perspective. This is a huge consequence, especially when you think about inhalers. Inhalers, the FDA requires similarity or identicality in plume geometry, particle size distribution, spray pattern. And so basically it means that when you take a nasal spray, you don't want it to shoot in your nose like a gun and then have it drip out, right? You want it to be a plume and kind of coat the inside of your nose, and then maybe you're also inhaling it. In emergency devices, it's not enough for a generic device to also show that it's safe and efficacious, meaning that it works in the same way as the RLD. However, the FDA also requires comparative human factor studies that allow the patient or the patient's grandmother, teachers, nurses, or other people to be able to use that with first-use success. And the FDA requires almost 99% first-use success studies. So again, it's in one of those situations where if the exclusive contract exists on the RLD device itself, it makes it very problematic for generic companies to use different devices. Thank you.
Our next question is for Ms. Dave. You are a patient who has spoken out about anti-competitive practices that hamper generic and biosimilar availability for American patients. Could you speak to why generic and biosimilar availability is so important?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Sneha Dave, and I'm the Executive Director at Generation Patient. And we have been working on antitrust and particularly on patent issues for the last couple of years. And we believe strongly in making the connection between antitrust and patient lives, particularly young adult patients, because there's two unique aspects of young adulthood and living with a chronic illness during this time period that should be highlighted. One, unchecked monopolies power stifles innovation and distorts R&D priorities. Young adults, many in our community who are in their early 20s, rely on breakthrough innovations and real novel innovations rather than incremental advances in medications. Our community is going to live with these conditions for the rest of our lives, so these innovations really matter as we consider the rest of our lives. There's also oftentimes an unfortunate loss of insurance in our community, creating gaps in coverage and making biosimilars and particularly generics even crucial during this time period. We commend the FTC and DOJ for their leadership in uncovering and addressing these anti-competitive tactics and hope for meaningful policy change and administrative action to address pharma's anti-competitive behavior so all Americans, especially the next generation of Americans, can readily access and afford their medications. We began initially investigating pharma's monopolization practices because many of us, including myself, were on therapeutics like Humira. What we uncovered were that patents and not necessarily the cost of ingredients or manufacturing were the reasons why our drug prices were so high and why so many of our community members were unable to afford their therapeutics. While Humira gets a lot of attention, it is unfortunately not an isolated case. we see lately with Ozempic having filed about over 300 patents, and cases of patent thicketing, product hopping, and pay for delay becoming incredible barriers for our community to be able to thrive into adulthood and to be able to have meaningful futures. FTC's work has shown that brand name companies are using tactics to undermine price competition, and they are using these patent thickets to force generic and biosimilar drug companies into agreements that restrict access, and that should be considered anti-competitive. When we look at pay-for-delay agreements, we also look at some of the upstream factors that enable this to occur. The excessive granting of low-quality patents and secondary and continuation patents, which are weaker and oftentimes not even on the compound, which is what's the most meaningful for patients. As we think about challenges with patient access to generics and biosimilars and the systems that enable this lack of timely access, we think about the issues that fall for generic drug companies and biosimilar drug companies from entering the market. Today, brand name pharma companies are nonstop patent machines, defining the smallest product changes as innovative and worthy of patents and making changes just so that they can apply for more patents. And these are patents that are, again, not meaningful for patient lives. Brand name companies repeatedly sue to prevent generics from coming to the market, effectively keeping our drug prices high and the cost of our therapeutics unaffordable. We also know that the automatic 30-month stay was meant to resolve disputes over core compound patents while a generic drug sought approval. Hatch-Waxman was not intended for secondary and continuation patents, aka weaker patents. As far as our struggles with access to biosimilars, we look at issues of private labeling and rebates, which I know will be covered in later panels, but I would like to bring attention to the fact that PBMs use their power to favor their own biosimilars, delaying adoption of other biosimilars. There's also cases of brand name companies launching authorized generic and biosimilar and private labeling deals with some PBMs, which allow competitors to enter the market, but it's not the competition due to the manipulation of the market by the brand name company. This ultimately undermines the intent of the BPCIA. We believe, as a patient advocacy group, that the DOJ and the FTC have an opportunity to continue to elevate patent quality as a public interest issue in agency rulemakings and reports. Addressing antitrust behaviors and upstream issues would greatly advance the president's goal to lower drug prices and increase competition, and would complement FTC and DOJ's efforts to rein in pay-for-delay deals and other patent abuse tactics. FDA, HHS, FTC, and DOJ can together enact meaningful solutions to lower drug costs for Americans while promoting fair competition. And lastly, before I conclude, I just want to comment on two common points that we hear from the pharmaceutical industry. One is focused on R&D and innovation. Contrary to industry claims, strengthening patent protections reduces rather than increases pharmaceutical innovation and meaningful innovation for patients. I have to wrap up, but I also want to acknowledge the risk of investing in new therapeutics and innovations, but that does not necessitate the creation of unfair monopolies. The current patent system creates perverse incentives that direct research toward incremental modifications of existing drugs rather than genuine breakthroughs. Lastly, PBMs, hospitals, insurers, and just about everyone is blamed by the pharmaceutical industry. They all have a role to play. However, the pharmaceutical industry must take advantage for their antitrust violations and poor patent quality submissions to keep monopolies. Legislation also has to move at the speed at which they are engaging in such practices. And finally, we see patients as the drivers of this work. We can come share the stories of ourselves and the devastating stories of our peers, but it will only make a difference if we are at the table and patient experiences are taken into consideration when thinking about patent quality and the impact of monopolies on our daily lives. Our community of the current and next generation of patients looks forward to ensuring that antitrust issues continue to be prioritized within this administration. Thank you.
Our next question is for Mr. Zauer. The President's executive order on lowering drug prices for American patients emphasizes the importance of harnessing competition to increase access to affordable medicines. What are some of the IP-related strategies used by drug manufacturers that impact the entry of lower-cost competition, especially those that might delay or prevent market entry of generics or biosimilars?
First, thank you for having me. So to frame the question in my own mind, right, as I see the panels, when talking about the cost of drugs or the cost of drugs to consumers, sometimes the question is, how much are we paying? Well, I understand this panel to be about how long are we paying? Right? When does lower cost competition enter the market, and what are the determinants of when that market entry occurs? Much of that is a bit clouded by there are very large amounts of information out there in the public sphere that have been published sometimes in peer-reviewed journals, other times in white papers, sometimes they're being amplified in the public media. But there's a body of information that we can also rely on where we say this is pretty well established and has been studied a number of times. So before I can talk a little bit about strategies, I want to offer a few data points that we can state with confidence because they've been studied for a long time and they've been looked at repeatedly with different methodologies. So I would start perhaps by the number of patents, right? It's often being said that it feels like pharmaceutical companies are getting like large numbers of patents on their products. Why do pharmaceutical companies have more than one patent on a product, which seems to be the normal paradigm, right? At least in public narrative. It's not a very normal paradigm. I can show you golf balls that have 50 patents on them, right? So the embedding of multiple innovations in a single product is not unique to the biotech industry. And if there's concern that, for example, a modern biotech drug may be covered by, pick a number of patents, more than one, right? The answer on one level would be, well, modern biotech drugs are not much more simple than golf balls. In fact, I think they're often more complicated. So it's not particularly surprising that modern advanced drug products would be covered by more than one patent. Well, how many? Well, we have an idea of how many, at least on some level. For small molecule drugs, the typical number is 4 to 6 that have been found in the Orange Book. So when you go through the Orange Book, that is the average number today, a very typical number. For biosimilar litigation, the number is different. There are more. The typical number is about 10 to 15 patents that get litigated, right, when there is litigation. We also know that these patents, when you look at them, are of roughly similar, sometimes better quality than in other technology areas, but these patents don't stand out like as being uniquely different from the way other innovative industries claim their inventions and patents. And this has been studied, the number of patents that I just gave you, 5 to 6 for small molecules, or about a dozen for biosimilars, has been studied repeatedly over the years and was most recently confirmed by the Patent and Trademark Office in last year's study on pharmaceutical patent and exclusivity parameters. Right? Time to entry, I guess that's where the rubber meets the road, right? How long does it take typically before lower cost competition does enter the market? Right? Very much has been said about that, but it's very, again, amenable to empirical study. We've known for a very long time that new chemical entity drugs, before they face generic competition in the marketplace, enjoy approximately 13 years in the marketplace before generic entry does occur. Right? It's about 10 years for for other than new chemical entity drugs, but 13 and 10 years, that time frame has been seen again and again and again by different groups looking at different parameters. And more importantly, it's been stable for about 30 years. Ever since people started looking, that's been the time frame until generic entry occurs, when it occurs. I have 1 minute left. Strategies. You asked about strategies. So I will leave you with this. There has been over time, this is true, a trend to file more patents in the Orange Book on the small molecule side. Right? It used to be 2 to 3 in the early 90s and 1980s. The current number is roughly 4 to 6, sometimes more, but not much more. So 4 to 6. That trend is there. Anecdotally, we also know that there are fewer new chemical entity drugs that enter the market that don't have patents that protect the molecule itself. It used to be 20, 25 years ago that about 1/3 of new chemical entity drugs that enter the market and that get FDA approval don't even have patents on the molecule. Right? That, I think, is changing. Drugs tend to go to market less if they don't have patents that protect the molecule itself. But that is one trend that we've seen over time. So the increased patent filing, I think, is part of a trend that we're seeing. On the generic side, it's also been established that generics have over time brought more patent challenges, paragraph 4 challenges, earlier in time than they did in the early 1990s. So practices have changed on the generic side as well. The effect has been, certainly it looks that way to us, that both parties to these litigations, the innovators and the generics, are employing strategies that have the effect of maintaining rather than changing historic levels of market exclusivity. Right? So one side, through their tactics, prevents this market exclusivity from becoming longer. The other side prevents it from becoming shorter. The effect is that for 30 years we've had, a normal market life on the small molecule side of about 13 years for new chemical entities, and that hasn't really been changing. So this will be my last remark. As we go forward, right, it's going to be very important to account for the reality that the system is in a kind of steady state. Both sides on the V are and have been changing their strategies, but the effect has been, right, to produce largely the same outcomes, at least time-wise, that we had 30 years ago. And that will be an important consideration going forward. Also to keep in mind in the face of narratives that the system is unstable, what has been changing, that there are recent abuses that really tilt the system in ways in which it hasn't been. That's not an observation we can make. We can reserve another conversation for biosimilars, where we have fewer data, less information, where we have reason to think that incentives are different, and where we can also have a more differentiated discussion. But it's the steady state notion that I want to leave you with respect to timing. Thank you.
Our next question is for Dr. Schondelmeyer. Even when pharmaceutical treatments for a condition are available, that doesn't mean that every patient with that condition will have access to those treatments. The complexity of the pharmaceutical supply chain offers many opportunities for ultimate market access to be impacted. Could you speak to some of the competition concerns that affect generic and biosimilar availability that stem from the pharmaceutical supply chain?
Thanks for the question. And as my colleagues said, I'm presenting my own views and not that of the university where I work. And it's based on about 50 years of studying the pharmaceutical market and virtually every drug in the market during that time and the market behaviors. First, let me remind us that virtually everyone uses, has used, or will use a prescription drug in their lifetime. They're valuable to us. They provide help to us in many ways. They can provide life-saving therapy. They can extend care. They can even improve the quality of life. But inability to access a drug when it's needed is critical and can result in life-ending consequences for an individual or even threaten the health of a community, the nation, or even our military, for example. Also, let me remind us that generic drugs that we're primarily focusing on today, and biosimilars I would lump in with that generically, so to speak. Generic drugs are a cornerstone of our American pharmaceutical market, and 9 out of 10 prescriptions filled in a pharmacy are for a generic drug. They've helped hold down the cost of paying for drugs for the American population. If we didn't have generics and weren't using them as extensively and with the low-cost products that are in the market today, Congress would be struggling even harder to figure out how to pay for Medicare and Medicaid. It would be a real challenge. We may not be able to provide all of the care that we do. And then I want to point out, it would be short-sighted to think that after decades-long development of the anti-competitive behaviors we see in the market today, and I'm talking for 3 or 4 decades of development, there's no single simple change that's going to solve all this. But I think change is worth pursuing. Policies are available, but we need integrated and coordinated policies that cut across different issues that you'll hear about from our panel and the next panel and the next two listening sessions. So we need coordinated approaches. Competition is a dynamic process. When you squeeze one place in the market, you see bulges somewhere else in the market. And policies need to be developed not only with a focus on what to squeeze, but where's the bulge going to be and how do we keep it in bounds also. So we need to look at the dynamic of that marketplace. In particular, the market behavior over the last 40 years that has occurred after the Hatch-Waxman Act is very important for us to understand and to realize that this market was changed dramatically by Hatch-Waxman. But over those 40 years, we've had many unintended consequences actively pursued by various players in the market, and many have been institutionalized in the market and made the market more anti-competitive rather than less anti-competitive. And so we need to go back and re-examine what is the net effect of that Hatch-Waxman Act over time. I think it was good, the right thing for the right reasons. And I'll remind you that the title of that act is the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act, two major objectives. And I think there's been a lot more done to support the patent term restoration side than there has drug price competition. There has been some on the drug price competition side, but we've seen that eroding away over time as various changes come to play. Finally, I want to focus on specialty drugs and the limited drug distribution systems in our market. Specialty drugs, first of all, there is no statutory definition of specialty drugs in general in the marketplace. And the marketplace has defined specialty drugs, and even among different players in the market, there's no standardized definition of specialty drugs. Each player defines specialty to be what serves their needs and their interest in operating a business and generating revenue. It may or may not be in the best interest of the patients they serve or the economy as a whole or driving competition, but it's more of a market-driven, self-serving definition. I think we need some standardization in the specialty market and definitions and some guardrails. Specialty drugs 10 years ago represented about 1% of the prescriptions and 30% of the dollars we spend on drugs. Today, they represent 2 or 3% of the prescriptions and about 2/3 of the dollars we spend on prescription drugs, just for those 2 or 3% of the market. They are the fastest growing, the highest expenditure component in the pharmaceutical market space today. Likewise, specialty pharmacies are not defined or licensed any differently than any other retail pharmacy, although they would have you believe that they're substantially different and they're authorized to do things that a pharmacy can't do. That's not necessarily true. In summary, really, the definition of specialty products results in steering of patients into limited distribution channels in the marketplace. We have drugs that you can only get at 1 to 5 pharmacies for the whole nation. So whether I'm in Indianapolis or Minneapolis or Los Angeles or New York or Washington, I have to contact and get the drug from one pharmacy that may be in Florida. And limited distribution drugs limit access, they take time delays, and it puts the control of the economics of that drug product in the hands of the manufacturer and the few players they contract with to distribute their drug, and it allows them to engage in price maintenance schemes and contractual terms that restrict sale of the drug to generic companies, for example, to develop a standard against a reference listed drug or other issues. Most other developed countries have a process for evaluating the value of drugs in their market and for determining the relative value of that drug and holding drug firms accountable for reasonable prices, yet still rewarding them for true innovations in the market. I think we can do that in America as well. Value is not about price only, but value must always include an accounting for price. And we aren't very good at that in the U.S. market space. Finally, limited distribution drugs for each drug would mean that if I had 7 or 8 drugs I was taking, I might have to contact 7 or 8 different manufacturers to get each of those drugs as a patient. Can you imagine your grandmother doing that? Can you imagine you doing that, having the time to do that? And keep in mind, when a patent or exclusivity period ends for a specialty drug or biologic you might be on, will the specialty channel or the drug manufacturer who you buy that drug from encourage you to use a generic or a biosimilar? Not likely. Thank you.
Our next question on the panel is for Mr. Meyer. Mr. Meyer, you have had a front row seat to pay for delay agreements from the beginning and have been involved in all the landmark cases. It has now been just over 20 years since Congress enacted the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act, which requires pharmaceutical companies to report certain patent settlements to the FTC and DOJ. What are the current trends in pharmaceutical patent settlements, and what additional steps should Congress, the FTC, and others take to curb pay-for-delay agreements?
So first of all, thanks for inviting me, and quick caveats myself. I'm only speaking for myself. I'm retired, but I spent 33 years at the FTC, and you've just asked me to give 25 years in 5 minutes or less. I am going to restrict my comments to public information only, and I apologize in advance to the audience. And like the other speakers here today, there's just no way to avoid some of the jargon and some of the acronyms, and so there will be some of that. I just don't have the time to explain everything, but of course the listening tour is to the experts, so the experts know these things. I've been asked to talk about reverse payments, also sometimes referred to as pay for delay. Let me do the setup real quickly. The situation that occurs is you have a brand company suing on patent issues against a generic company, and it's saying the generic company wants to launch a competitive product to the brand, and the brand saying you violate my patents, and the generic says in return, first of all, your patents aren't even valid, and secondly, I've invented around your patents, and therefore, one way or another, I should be allowed to come in. And this all occurs under what's been referred to a number of times already as the Hatch-Waxman Act, an act passed in 1984, and as Professor Schondelmeyer so aptly described it, it had 2 objectives. One objective was to continue to promote innovation in America, and the other objective was to get lower-cost generic products to market sooner so that consumers could benefit from the lower costs. The concern that the FTC had as we saw these things, and this started back in 1999, back in my early days when I wasn't quite as white-haired as now. And as we started to look at these things, we started to see a disturbing trend in these settlements in which the brand company was paying the generic company, that's at least what we were alleging, to stay out of the market. And the reason it was called a reverse payment was because, generally speaking, in most patent litigation, the putative infringer, which would be the generic company in this case, is paying for a license to the patent holder, to the putative valid patent, and is trying to pay to get in, is not being paid by the patent holder, who allegedly has a valid patent, to stay out. And that's why it's sometimes called a reverse payment. And the 2 terms that we found that had to be present in any agreement that would cause us concern is, 1, there's some form of consideration or payment running to the generic company, and 2, the generic company in return agrees to stay out for some period of time. The problem with that, from an antitrust standpoint, is it reflects a sharing of monopoly profits between the brand and the generic, because before the entry, the brand's making all the sales and getting all the profits, and now it's giving some portion of those profits through the payment to the generic, and the person that's being screwed in that deal is the consumer, who would otherwise expect to get a generic product that is priced significantly lower. So instead of letting the consumers have the lower price, they're finding a way to share that excess gain between the 2. So in response to the question about sort of what the evolution of these payments, that's been probably the most interesting thing that we've observed over time, is how these payments flowed. In the very, very early agreements, 2000 to 2002, you saw essentially what was a bag of cash. I mean, it was a wire transfer. It wasn't physical money, but it was a wire transfer from the brand to the generic. But at some point, companies kind of got the picture that this doesn't look too good. And we stopped that practice pretty well. Had a number of consents early in 2000, 2001, and 2002 where companies just agreed, we're not going to do this anymore. But they got more sophisticated. There's a lot at stake here. There's a lot of financial interest here. There's a lot of really clever people and clever lawyering going on and smart people. So they started doing a lot of, in addition to doing a patent license, they started doing a lot of side business deals. Now, again, in these side business deals, the cash flow, or the money flow, I should say, always went from the brand to the generic. They found these side deals. So in the second generation, you had these side deals. What we now have is a third generation that's very aptly described by the FTC in a recent January 2025 blog, and some MMA reports that's under the Medicare Modernization Act, the fact that the agencies, FTC and DOJ, get all these agreements and can review them. And they have found that there's a whole bunch of little additional kinds of ways that this money is flowing, that these payments are flowing. And these third generation cases haven't been investigated to date. Now, I'm not a politician, and I didn't come here to make political statements. I was a career civil servant, but frankly, it just was not a priority of the FTC chairman in my last, before I retired, during the Biden administration. And so I would recommend, my recommendation would be that the FTC consider opening one or more investigations into some of these additional practices that we're now seeing that you've identified so aptly in the blog. Thank you.
Our next question is for Ms. Dave. As a patient advocate for young adults with chronic conditions, what changes would you like to see to improve access to affordable medicines?
Yes, so now I'm going to focus a little less on the FTC DOJ side, even though I know this listening session is for the FTC and DOJ. I think as a patient and a patient advocacy group, we are really excited about current legislative solutions that exist to reframe and reform the patent system, namely on legislation related to patent thickets, USPTO FDA collaboration to ensure better data sharing between both agencies, and so that brand companies are not telling FDA something and PTO something else. I also think we're really excited to push the Patent and Trademark Office to reframe their role as a public interest agency rather than favoring private industry. As we think about PTO's current standard of novelty and non-obviousness, continuing to push them to really grant patents that are novel and not obvious, and that have a real impact on patient lives. We also would love to see reforms at the PTO, such as increasing patent examiner time on scientific patents, so making sure that they have adequate time to review information. There's a recent Government Accountability Office report that showed that patent examiners were begging for extra time. And so thinking about the holistic nature of what it takes to review and grant a patent to prevent monopolies. And lastly, to increase public engagement within the patent system, we as the patient advocacy group, the public, is craving to have a greater role in these decisions that agencies make on behalf of us and our communities. And so as we think about increasing the opportunity to challenge bad patents against the Patent and Trial Appeal Board, for example, instead of rescinding that opportunity, making sure that PTAB decisions include patient voices as they're thinking about invalidating or not invalidating bad patents. So these are reforms that we'd like to see both on the legislative side but within agencies as we think about what will move the needle forward to prevent monopolies and promote fair competition for American patients.
I neglected at the top of the session to welcome, and Ms. Dave kindly reminded me, we have a couple of PTO colleagues here today in the audience, as well as a colleague from the Commerce Department front office. And so welcome. Thank you for being here today, and we look forward to your collaboration.
Our next question is back to Dr. Schondelmeyer. So Dr. Schondelmeyer, our discussion has touched on anti-competitive conduct that is largely driven by brand companies, but there have been several lawsuits against generic drug manufacturers for alleged price fixing of generic drugs. How can collusive agreements to artificially inflate prices and reduce competition be deterred?
Thanks for that question. Actually, the best case or broadest case of price fixing of that type occurred a little over a decade ago. Actually, the behaviors maybe in 2010, 11, 12, and then the suits came in 2013, 14, I believe. these involve generic companies who their leaders would often meet informally at various meetings, at professional meetings or trade associations, and in the hallways they would have discussions. And these are allegations that were documented in the lawsuits that were filed, and so one can refer to those to see the kinds of discussions they had. But what it resulted in was also we'd had mergers and acquisitions and consolidation in the generic market, so there were a lot fewer players. And so the key players began discussions and said, we're not going to fix the price per se directly, but what we're going to do is we'll decide who gets the next new generic that comes on the market, and we'll allocate the new generic market. You get this one, and we'll get this one, and we'll give them this one. And they decided who gets the market for a new generic, and then that left those players in that market as the only or the dominant player and able to set much higher prices than a economically competitive market would do. So price fixing can occur by blocking others out of the market or allocating markets that one will take. I think in much the same way we see those behaviors happening in the specialty market today. So what can be done? One, we need to very carefully review mergers and acquisitions. Not long ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, we had the largest generic company based in the U.S. merge with one of the largest brand name companies in the world who had a big generic division merge. And there was a lot of overlap with their products. It really took competition and players out of the market, but that was let through as a merger that wasn't challenged. I think we need to look more carefully at mergers and acquisitions. We need to look at allocation of how companies end up with different products. It may be they deal with the API or the key starting materials, but they may just do it by saying, I don't care how you get there, you get this product and I get that one. So we need to watch for. I saw that behavior in the pricing data I monitor even before the lawsuits occurred. So I think one could also monitor pricing behavior in the market and see signals that say, hey, there's something going on here that needs to be investigated. So I think we need to watch pricing patterns in the market and act upon those as well.
Our next question is for Mr. Upati. In addition to patents, pharmaceutical products can obtain regulatory exclusivities that can further extend the horizon for generic or biosimilar entry. Could you address concerns about the use of regulatory exclusivities by brand companies to delay entry of lower-priced competitors?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So on regulatory exclusivities, independent of patent exclusivities, and oftentimes they're actually intertwined. So for a regulatory exclusivity, the brand company may, do some type of new patient population studies. They may do orphan drug studies, and they're entitled to, generally speaking, 3 years of FDA market exclusivity. So this is not data exclusivity, but market exclusivity. And so for a generic company's perspective, they would look at this exclusivity and say, does this keep us off the market or the ANDA sponsor off the market completely because they can't get around the regulatory exclusivity? Or is it something in which they could so-called carve out the 3-year regulatory exclusivity and still go to the market with less than all of the indications or less than all of the exclusivities that are there? But regulatory exclusivities are often also intertwined with the patents that follow along. So if there's a new indication that comes along, generally speaking, there might be a second or third method of use patent related to using that drug molecule X for the new treatment of disease condition Y. And then again, that factors into the ANDA sponsors' patent challenge strategy, their regulatory exclusivity strategies. How are they going to be doing their marketing? And then, of course, whether these exclusivities come after an ANDA sponsor has already launched, then it largely becomes an irrelevant consequence for the ANDA sponsor because they're already on the market. And so then if the FDA requires them to put some type of regulatory exclusivity in there, they don't need to necessarily because they have a fully approved ANDA drug and with an ANDA label. But I do want to also mention that at the end of the day, patent exclusivities, can be intertwined. And, can I make one comment on some of the things that I've also heard? Okay, so I wanted to mention that there's a lot of talk about patenting too much and there's too many patents. Generic companies get patents too. And generic companies get patents on polymorphs, formulations, other methods of manufacture. And while generic versus generic patent infringement is not the norm, it does happen. So we can't obviously demonize any one side of the industry for obtaining patents. Secondly, I also wanted to say is, who's in this room is going to be the person that's going to say there's too many patents? What's the number? Is there a number? When we hear 140, 130, should it be 110? Who's to adjudicate how many patents that are there? And there was a comment made about patents on incremental. 99% of all patents that are issued by the United States Patent Office are not on the core technology. It's on the incremental basis of it. So there's nothing that the pharmaceutical industry is doing differently in terms of patenting another formulation or a second or a third formulation that is beyond the bare naked compound. So I agree, once the bare naked compound is patented, then you have series of formulation patents, method of use patents, polymorph enantiomer, racemates, you name it. But whether they're called incremental or not should not at all be a castigation of their value or their worth. They drive innovation, and like any other person in the generic industry, once the brand company has launched the product, it becomes a target for the generic company. There is no generic industry if there's no innovation by the pharma industry. There's no innovation that's going to be rewarded if there's no patents available to them. So it's a natural flow that once the branded product, earns its life cycle, and as Hans was saying, maybe 12 years, 13 years down the road, the generic companies, enter, and that becomes the natural life cycle. And this is something I learned when I was at Novartis, where we had the Sandoz generic division, and we were, in a sense, told that the brand company's profits flow to Sandoz. Sandoz then uses the money it makes on the generic industry to go to the top of the Novartis pipeline, which then funds the next branded drug. So I just wanted to kind of dispel, some myths. Thank you.
Our next question is for Mr. Zauer. The number of patents that drug companies apply for and obtain has significantly increased in recent years, which in turn has expanded the scope of litigation against generic or biosimilar manufacturers. How does this dynamic impact market access and incentives for future development of generic and biosimilar products?
Well, first, short of, I'm not sure I would endorse the notion of, the number of patents has increased in recent years, because I don't think we have much of a baseline to go on, except for, what we can observe over time in the Orange Book. And I mentioned earlier, there has been a trend, it's true. Right, the typical number, the average number of patents per drug, new chemical entity, that's listed in the Orange Book has gone from about 2 to 3 in the early 90s to 4 to 6 or a little more today, right? So that is an increase over time. It's a doubling, but it's still not a very large number of patents, right? There are no generic litigations that involve 50, 60, or however numbers of patents that you might be hearing in the public sphere. For biosimilars litigation, we don't have a baseline over time. Well, it has been observed, though, that, it is true. It looks like biologic innovators do keep filing patents after their drug is already on the market. Right? And there's a suspicion that this reflects somehow strategic behavior where the patent lawyers sit down with the CEOs, right? And the medical people are somewhere in the background, but the company behaves strategically in the way they generate patents solely to maintain whatever it is, right? Some kind of, you might describe it as a monopoly. I'm not quite sure that's a proper description. There's nothing unusual about innovative companies, once their products reach the marketplace, to continue to spend money on the product, broaden its usefulness in the marketplace, make it more useful for broader patient populations, change it in ways that promote adherence, or even just to manufacture the product in ways that are more cheap, more consistent today than they were 15 years ago when the drug was launched. Right? People often say, when they mean, large numbers of patents are apparently being filed on this drug, that there's something going on that reflects something other than innovation. I don't think I want to be the judge of that. It is very pithy, right, and simple and facile almost to say, there are lots of patents cover medically meaningless innovations. I would leave that decision to caretakers, doctors, physicians, patients, and others who actually use this drug, because the objection that these innovations are meaningless usually comes from people other than the medical community or the people who actually use these products. Very quickly, when we look at both the numbers and the expiration dates of patents that cover a drug, right? And we look at, what's the effect of either the number of patents or these expiration dates on the date of entry. When you see what's going on, you will find that the numbers don't correlate. So the numbers of patents or the expiration dates of patents are a very poor predictor of generic entry. There are drugs in the Orange Book today, innovator drugs, that have had generic competition for 10 years, that still have patents listed that go out for another 5 or 10 years in the future, but competition is already happening. One way that's happening, I'll just give you a few because they've been mentioned, right? Skinny labeling is a very important aspect of generic entry. People speak about patents as if they had this incredible blocking power, when fully 1/3 of, or by some accounts 40% of generics actually go to market with less than all the indications that the innovator drug is labeled for. Well, that is one way of sidestepping either regulatory exclusivities, the 3-year new clinical trial exclusivity, or patents on the uses of these drugs that are listed in the Orange Book. They very often don't form a realistic obstacle to market entry, right? Another thing that has been mentioned, the 30-month stay, right, of great interest to the FTC. The 30-month stay, for all the attention it gets, actually has also been shown to have relatively little impact on the actual market entry of generic drugs. But when you look at when generic drugs launch, it is almost never at the expiration of a 30-month stay or at the end of litigation, if there even is litigation. Right? Generic entry occurs years after the expiration of the 30-month stay, and I would almost suggest, as a field of study, to figure out what happens if we didn't have a 30-month stay at all. Would anything change with respect to the timing of generic market entry? I'm not sure it would. Partly for the reason that the FDA review time from submission of an ANDA to its actual approval is in excess of 30 months anyway. Right? So to have a more realistic appraisal of what I would say these narratives is going to be very important going forward, and I actually look forward, as you develop your study, that I hope you will receive a lot of information that's been empirically studied and given, so that will inform your study in ways that I think are more reliable than a lot of narratives that we've seen in the marketplace that we don't think are always particularly trustworthy. So thank you.
Our final question for panel 1 goes to Mr. Meyer. Mr. Meyer, you've had many years of experience with antitrust enforcement in the pharmaceutical industry. What lessons can you share with us?
Well, I've got 3 minutes for 3 lessons. So thank you for that question. And I'm not restricting myself to just reverse payments. Virtually everything this panel identified as problems were things that we have touched on or done directly taken actions at the FTC, or written amicus briefs about, or done research on, and it's all aptly summarized in a publication. I have the last version with my name on it from 2023. It's been updated. My good colleague, Kara, updates it every 2 or 3 times a year. But so anybody's interested, like I said, I've already used up a minute, so I've got 2 minutes left. Look, here's my big lessons. Number one, antitrust enforcement is at best a distant second best to real legislative reform and regulatory reform. And working together with the FDA, with the Patent and Trademark Office, with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, with the FTC and DOJ, working with them is just hugely important, and was a big part of what we used to do. We used to do a lot of technical assistance on the Hill to provide on legislative, and we got some pretty important legislation done over the years, but there's still additional things that need to be done. The problem with antitrust enforcement, as you heard from my 25 years and 5 minutes, is it's slow, and it's uncertain, and it's limited. You can't just go in and fix every problem, because a lot of problems aren't really antitrust problems at their core. Number two, despite all the gaming we've heard, and I would have said this even when I was at the FTC, the Hatch-Waxman Act was largely successful, has largely been successful in accomplishing its two goals. We have a very innovative pharmaceutical industry in the United States, and I hope it continues. It certainly was very innovative during the time I worked on these issues. And U.S. consumers do benefit, as Dr. Schondelmeyer said, from generics. 90% of prescriptions, as he pointed out, 20% of the spend. 10% of prescriptions are brand, 80% of the spend. Okay? We spend less on generics than most of our other developed countries around the world, because they don't get the generics as cheaply as we do. We pay a lot more for the brands, but we pay a lot less for the generics. So we have to be careful. We have to be careful. This has to be surgical. We can't just disrupt the whole system. And again, I would have said that even if somebody had asked me during my government working days. I don't know what the state of play is today, Gail, my good friend Gail. I don't know what the state of play is on legislation, Kara, how much openness there is in the administration for legislative fixes. I think there is limited scope, more limited scope than it used to be for regulatory fixes because of some of the things the Supreme Court's done to dial back the administrative state. So absolutely, there's still a role for antitrust, despite the fact that it's slow and uncertain and limited. Thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists for your insights. We are going to take a momentary break, and then we're going to come back and move into panel 2. Thank you.